Sanbonani, welcome. I'm Debu and this is her story. I'm so excited that this day has finally come and we're going to have our first conversation in what I hope will be a series of conversations around religious authority, sexual abuse of adult women. And so I just really want to invite you on this journey with me. And that's why I actually opened up by using Sanibonani. Yes, it's a greeting, it's hello, but it's also loosely translated to say, I see you. And it's an intentional invitation for you to come and see into this space, which is normally not seen in the context of sexual abuse of adult women. Somebody last week in the comments referred to it as an enchanted space, and I thought that was such a beautiful way to capture it. And me saying Sanibonani is really an intentional invitation to say, come, let us see into these enchanted spaces. Come, let us see the people that are normally not seen as victims of sexual abuse. You know, like I said in the previous segment, that a lot of the time people just think these were affairs that have gone wrong, and I'm saying let's take the time to be intentional, to see into these spaces and to hear the voices and the stories. So Sanbonani. Okay, so we're gonna get into it. Just one last note is that, you know, I told you guys I'm old school like that. I still have my notes, so I'm going to be looking down every now and then. Please allow me to do that, because I simply want to make sure that I really relay everything that I want to relay, that I think is significant to get across. And, you know, while this is a conversation and I would love for it to carry that tone, it is also an effort to educate, because I believe one of the solutions to the silences is to educate and to bring about knowledge. So I'm really going to try my best and be as conversational as possible, but every now and then I will need to get a little bit technical, just to empower you with the precise knowledge that is needed in this field. Okay, so I'm going to try to strike a balance, but for the most part, it is a conversation. I want it to be a conversation. So yes, let's get right into it. So we are talking about sexual grooming today. We're talking about the sexual grooming of adults by people who are in a position of religious authority. So that is your pastor, your prophet. Sometimes they're called clergy, father, minister, you know, whatever denomination you're in, they might use a different phrase. But essentially what I'm talking about a person who is in a position of authority within a religious community, okay? And I'm talking about adults. So I am saying, or I'm rather referring to people who are at legally consenting ages to engage in sex, because a lot of the research is often focused on children, and I said it before, I'm a champion of that. I think there definitely is a need to focus on children, but I'm also saying there are silences when it comes to adult women, and for me those silences are definitely loud. You know, when silence becomes loud, and for me it's a space that I just can't ignore. So before I get into the details and we really dive into our conversation, I want to once again kind of backtrack and preface as to why am I focusing on this topic and why me in particular, okay? So why am I focusing on this topic? Sexual violence is an assignment, I think, for me. In retrospect, I see having been assigned to kind of be in that space just in different manifestations. So I've always been an activist, to put it that way. You know, I've always felt the need to lend my voice to people and spaces that might not necessarily be able to speak. You know, I was the kid that spoke against the bully, you know. And even in my academic career, I've always gravitated to issues of justice and issues around sexual violence. Even with my master's thesis in 2010, I did it on sexual violence. Actually, I did it on child sexual abuse, and I was looking at a victim of child sexual abuse and how she had turned to religious coping as a mechanism to kind of get through that experience and positively adapt to life after that experience. So essentially, this was a woman who was sexually violated at a young age as a child. She was raped. But she was able to turn to her sense of religion and spirituality and God and that religious community that she was part of as a a layer of strength and coping. So that helped her to actually navigate through that experience successfully. And she lives a really well adapted life now as an adult. And she accredits that largely to the fact that she had a strong connection to a religious community and her faith. 10 years later, after that study, I've kind of flipped the script a bit, and now I've moved from psychology into human rights law. And within that field, again, I'm looking at sexual violence. That's why I'm saying it's always been my assignment. But this time I'm looking at it, I've kind of flipped the script, because I'm looking at it now when the sexual violence is committed within that religious community, religious space, and by the person who in my previous study would have been the source of coping and encouragement and protection. And that is really the religious leader, clergy, pastor, bishop, prophet, whatever you call him in your particular space. And obviously now I'm looking at it from a human rights lens. There's a little bit of psychology to my study, but it's primarily a human rights lens. So this is why I'm talking about sexual violence, because it's an assignment for me. It's not coming now. It's just in different seasons, the different manifestations of that assignment. And for the here and now, talking to you is a way that I feel convicted to kind of fulfill that assignment. Okay, so the other thing is that I believe that we really need to engage on sexual violence. One, in South Africa, gender-based violence, which sexual violence is an expression of gender-based violence. It's an epidemic. It's that bad. It's an epidemic. The president declared it so. Gender-based violence is an epidemic that we are fighting over and above COVID and every other thing that we're dealing with in South Africa right now. And it's a significant human rights issue. I mean, sexual violence, I mean, if we kind of like narrow it down, because there are many manifestations of sexual violence, but let's just talk about rape for a second. Rape is one of those violations that is so multi-layered and so multifaceted that that single act of rape actually violates multiple human rights simultaneously. So in rape, your dignity is violated. You know, your right to bodily security is violated, all in one act. So that's significant. And also, I mean, just to capture the significance of sexual violence, because some people think it's just sex, you know, I mean, it's, you know, it's not that big of a deal. And that normally comes from a lack of understanding of just the depth of the violation and the gravity of the violation. And to capture that, I mean, we see how even within the larger framework of human rights, rape can sometimes be classified as an act of genocide. That's what happened in Rwanda, where rape was used as an act of genocide. It can now be acknowledged as an act of torture, where rape is actually torture, you know. It's a war crime. A violation against multiple human rights. So really it's a significant topic, and we need to talk about it. And also because, like I said, now when we start to enter into the realm of religion, it's a realm where there's multiple rights. So there are rights, like I spoke about, you know, your dignity and bodily security, and there's women's rights, you know, that's kind of one side of the camp. But then there's also now religious liberties and religious freedom. You know, we have the right to believe whatever we want to believe and to practice our faith. And most governments want to kind of put a wall of separation between that, because people need to enjoy whatever religion it is that they believe in. And that's why, for the most part, religious communities, they get a level of protection from scrutiny, because everybody is careful not to infringe on religious beliefs, because there are societies where that right to religious freedom is being violated, and that's wrong. And I think just to keep it safe, we kind of keep a safe distance between religion and state and government. And while there's a place for that, the problem is that within religious communities, when there's such a wall of separation, that breeds a lack of accountability, because nobody really checks into those communities. They don't see into those communities, because we don't want to, you know, interfere with people's right to enjoy their religion. And then you have situations like we saw with the 7 angels where, people will say they account to no one but God. And while you can appreciate accountability to God, but it becomes problematic because what about accountability in the here and now? Because when we don't have mechanisms of justice and, consequence for action, and we let that go and say they will be addressed in the hereafter, that breeds impunity. And when there is no consequence for action and there's no punishment for bad behavior, why should you stop? So it's murky territory, and I think we really have to boldly kind of enter into these enchanted spaces and have dialogue and see into those spaces and see people who are otherwise not protected in those spaces. So that's why, okay? It's a really long roundabout way, but I want to really re-emphasize that. So I'm coming from an assignment, I'm coming from an academic perspective, and I'm coming from a place of saying this is a social problem, it's something that's here, it's in the now, and this is my small contribution towards that fight. Okay, so let's jump into it. I said today we're talking about sexual grooming. Now, sexual grooming there's a lot of technicalities and, stages and all of that and different types of grooming. And while I would want to kind of set it out, in sequential order and, separate different kinds, it's not very easy because it all kind of happens in flux sometimes. So I will try to, for the sake of clarity, kind of compartmentalize what I'm saying, but I know it's not always going to be possible. I won't get it right the whole time, so please bear with me. But with regards to sexual grooming, different scholars offer different ideas. And remember, most of the definitions are around children because there's an understanding of the fact that children need to be groomed into sexualized behavior and understanding because they normally don't really know much and they don't have definitions. So this person comes into their lives and offers obviously insight and thinking that is not correct, that they intend to use to suit their needs to abuse those children. But adults are also groomed. Even though they know what sex is, they know what happens in the context of sex, but they can be groomed. And this is the definition that most scholars agree applies to children and to adults, okay? The main components of grooming is that it is when somebody intentionally, systematically, so they are intentional and they are methodological about how they do it. So they are intentional and systematic in building a relationship with the person, creating trust, and breaking down boundaries, and these are psychological, physical, emotional boundaries, so that they can access that person and violate that trust through abuse, basically. So there's a systematic breaking down of physical, emotional, psychological defenses so that they can access somebody in an environment of trust and then sexually abuse that person. The goal is to get the person to comply with the abuse, to also play a part in maintaining the abuse and to keep it a secret. It is so messed up that the person actually wants to get you to a point where you are compliant with the abuse. I didn't say consent, I said compliant, and I will break that down later. So just for the sake of putting it into perspective in a real life example, I want to read an excerpt on somebody, and this is a real life experience, on how they narrated the abuse, okay, just to capture it, and they narrated what happened to them. So this person, who's obviously going to be anonymous, said, I was 27 years old when my pastor started touching me sexually. He had started the previous 2 years by gaining my trust. So like I said, it's systematic, it happens gradually, and it happens over time. So look at this, between the grooming, when the grooming started, and the actual sexual assault, there was 2 years. So he had started the previous 2 years by gaining my trust and my respect. He took an interest in my life. We talked about my hopes, my dreams, my aspirations, my spiritual life, and all the things I was struggling with in my walk with God. He basically took on the role of a father that I never had. What I didn't understand is that he was using his position of power to get close to me and tear down my defenses so that he could violate my body, my soul, and my spirit, all while hidden in plain sight. So just take a second to kind of let that sink in, that for this person, it was a violation not just of her body, but she says to her, it was a violation of her body, her soul, and her spirit. Worse yet, it happened hidden in plain sight. And there, it's just saying that this thing happened in front of everyone, but they couldn't see it. That's why we have to be intentional about seeing and making the effort to see, because this grooming is so insidious. It happens underneath, underneath the layers, and it's not overt. They don't show that, grooming is happening. They try to keep it really underneath, even I would say a layer of your consciousness to a certain extent, and that's the extent of the manipulation of grooming, actually. So with regards to grooming, there are types. So let me backtrack a little bit. So sexual violence, and I'll go back to this person's example that they said they were violated physically, spiritually, and even their soul was violated. Sexual violence is not just sex. And I know some people will say, she's an adult, she's not a virgin, she's had sex before, it's not that deep, it's not a big deal, and that really comes from a lack of appreciation of just how pervasive and enduring the consequences of sexual violation actually are. It's not just a wound physically. It affects the way you think, it affects future relationships, it affects how you see yourself, and in this context, it affects how you see God. It really has the potential to really kind of point your life in a different direction if obviously you don't get the help that you need. So because sexual violence affects you at multiple levels, the grooming is also at multiple levels. So you are groomed psychologically, and that's why you also see consequences psychologically. So you are also groomed physically, and that's why you also see consequences after sexual violence physically. And also your environment is groomed. And by environment, it's the church environment, it's your personal environment, your home space can also be groomed by this person who wants to make sure that once they commit this act of violence against you, the people in your community will not believe you, your family will not believe you, and they will protect him and not you. Or they will make it so, because the environment is so groomed, they will make it so difficult for you to even come out to the environment and say, this has happened to me, because you know that without a doubt they are for him, and anything that is against him then is against what they believe, and they would stand with him and not you. And that's just how it is. It's really manipulative, and it's really deep, and normally abusers isolate you psychologically and physically, that you feel like you have nowhere to turn to but him. So let's start with the first one, physical grooming. I mentioned this a bit last time, that it really is about these seemingly incidental physical touches that progressively get more intimate as time goes on. So I want to break it down at a practical level. So let's say, for example, you are attending a church and your bishop, is preaching, and perhaps he is preaching and walking around in the congregation. And this one day he walks around, he stops, and he looks at you, almost, that deep, alluring kind of look, where you feel like somebody is looking into your soul, kind of a thing. And it feels a bit intense, and you're wondering, okay. And then he just moves on like nothing happened, and you're wondering, was it spiritual? What was it? But it really felt intense. It felt, different, but, it was so incidental that you really feel like, what am I going to say? Pastor looked at me like, really? he looks at people, for all I know, maybe God was giving him a message about me. So you discount that. And then it progressively moves on to, Pastor, seeing you and greeting you, my daughter, but the handshake is that much longer than it should be and normally is. And it, your body feels like this is a little bit intimate, but he moves on to the next gentleman in front of you, and he does the same thing. He holds that gentleman for a long time and looks into his eyes, and you think, I'm making a big deal out of nothing. I mean, like really. Debu, stop it. You're overthinking, you start counseling yourself about what your body is feeling. And let's say after he's pushing boundaries, he's pushing physical boundaries as and he's grooming you to accept them with each and every push. And then let's say later on, perhaps you have the opportunity to see the bishop, prophet up close, and he leans over and he says, let me remove that. There's something by your eye. And the act in itself looks innocent, but it's just a bit too intimate having my man of God this close, this close. Like, was it necessary, And again, you probably will have something that feels like that was a bit weird. I mean, he could have just said, remove something from your eye, And perhaps that next week he preaches an entire sermon about, removing the log from your brother's eye. And there you sit questioning yourself and you're thinking, no, man, maybe this thing was spiritual. He was trying to show me something. There's a sin I need to deal with. Especially in religious communities, then we start to spiritualize everything and you start again, going against this feeling that you're having that, no, man. So for you now, a stare is normal and handshake is normal, that physical boundary, that closeness is normal, and it, because he's systematically introducing these things and he's pushing the boundaries until perhaps you're serving in the church or you're serving in that community, and a pastor comes to say, what, you're doing such a good job and I'm so happy that you're doing it, and he hugs, and then there's a bit of a back rub with that hug, and you're there and there are people and man of God is hugging you and everything in your body is saying there's a line that's been crossed here, but it's done in front of people, so you're thinking no person would do something inappropriate in plain sight. And those are the mind games. And that's part of how they're grooming the community, because when people start seeing pastor hugging a woman in front of them, he's grooming them to accept it and for them to think there's absolutely nothing wrong, because we have this idea that when people are doing something that's wrong, they'll do it in secret. So here's pastor hugging you in front of other people. He's in your space, your breasts are pressed against him, and really a physical boundary has been crossed, And after that, what normally happens, and this is actually part of a psychological element of that grooming, is that you'll be sitting with yourself and in your thoughts and thinking, man, I feel violated. I feel like a physical boundary that, pastor, daddy, prophet shouldn't cross. He's crossed that hug just didn't feel right, and maybe I'm imagining things, but I could swear that he kind of rubbed my back, while he was hugging me, So your body is feeling like a boundary has been crossed, like there's been some element of a violation. But your mind is thinking, but it was in plain sight. There were people, and the other time he held my hand, he also held that other guy's hand, and it, like looking at somebody is not a crime. If he looked at me, maybe he's hearing from God, So your mind and your body are feeling two separate things, and that's called dissonance. So there is no agreement between what your body feels the violation into your physical space, and your mind is trying to convince your body that no, this is normal, and there's a lack of agreement. And what that does is that it teaches you not to trust your guts, your instincts, not to trust your own thoughts about certain things, because you'll be having one thought and then within the environment he's grooming you to think that the way you're thinking about this is completely wrong and you're overthinking things. And that way you can't even trust yourself. actually you're starting to trust him more than you trust yourself. And he normalizes it. So part of physical grooming is that he normalizes sexualized behavior. So things that are intimate become normal within that community. So hugs become normal, and perhaps one day he'll even preach about greeting each other, with a brotherly kiss, and how people in Italy greet each other with a kiss and how culturally appropriate it is, So things that for you were not normal before now become normal to you and to the congregation, as a matter of fact. So you are there, you are perhaps an engaged person or a married person, and you've always thought that the physical boundaries are reserved for your husband, but now a new idea is being introduced into your thinking that, certain pecs are okay, and perhaps one day, after having preached that message, he might, let's do like the Italians. He already mentioned the Italians, so he's not trying to be sexual. That's what your mind is saying. And he's normalizing that behavior. And sometimes it's not even obvious behavior like a kiss, but it's behavior like you being alone with him in his office, for example, or in whatever other environment that you know in your heart of hearts that you have no business being alone with a man who is not your husband, for example. But it's normalized that, our pastor sometimes will call you to the sanctuary and ask for you to be there for a time of prayer, and even tell your parents, no, I've invited Debu to come for a time of prayer. So he's told the parents, so they're not going to think anything is wrong, or he's told your family that no, you're going to come for a time of prayer, and lo and behold, when you come for a time of prayer, he's also there. So you are now in an environment of physical proximity, and it's just the two of you. And it feels off. It feels off. But he's been gradually building. Your defenses around physical space are gradually lowered to a point where it's an exception with him. Things that were not an exception before now become normal, and they become an exception, and you're desensitized to the touches such that one day when he, says he wants to lay hands on you, he doesn't put them there. They're kind of there. And you again doubt yourself because last time you thought he was being sexual, but he wasn't sexual. So now you don't want to think about it too much because you just have all of these bad thoughts that are not right. You can't trust yourself. He's the man of God. He's spiritual and he's holy. So we trust him and we don't trust ourselves. And that's the battle that you end up going through in your mind. And also, physical grooming is also about him getting access to you, making it such that he can physically access you at any time. So this is, the pastor that kind of rocks up at your place of work or at your home, at 8 o'clock, there's a knock from the pastor, I was in the neighborhood, and I thought, let me stop by and, come and release a blessing upon your home. And obviously you're going to think, wow, this is a blessing. God has remembered us. The man of God is here, and the next time it will be at 10 o'clock. And what he's doing is that he's creating this situation where he has access to you, physical access to you, maybe it's a phone call at 12 o'clock. My daughter, how are you doing? I'm checking on you. Are you praying? He mixes it with some spirituality, but it is him methodologically and progressively making it such that he has physical access to you at any time. And you might be somebody, for example, who's married and you live with your family and your husband is there and he comes when your husband is there. So obviously anybody will think that if anybody wants to do something sinister, they won't come when my husband is there. He might come and, be buddy with your husband, and maybe even praise him and say, you know what, I've always wanted to meet you, sir, because, for you to be able to be the head of a woman like this, I really need to give honor where honor is due, you are doing a great job, and this man who probably has never been honored before, your husband is thinking, okay, this is my kind of pastor. He can see that, I'm trying my best here as a man in this house. Perhaps one day when he pops by unannounced, he comes with tickets, hey, how are you? I was gifted with these tickets to a Kaizer Chiefs and Pirates game, and I'm not one for going to soccer matches. The ministry keeps me busy, but I thought perhaps you would enjoy it. And here is your husband who's a football fanatic thinking, this is the kind of pastor we need. And he now is roped into the grooming without even being aware. He's now also starting to like the pastor, starting to trust the pastor, because everything looks like it's all out in the open. He's very transparent. And I think that's why this woman used "it's all hidden in plain sight," because a lot of these things, they're in plain sight. The only problem is that because you're not aware that you're being groomed, you only see it retrospectively. So after it's happened, that's when we normally start to connect the dots. Man, when he was doing this and then he was actually planning to eventually get me to this place where physically my defenses are down. And also remember, when we go to church, we are normally going there already, our defenses psychologically and physically are down, because we think church is a safe place. It's a safe space. It's called a sanctuary, a sanctuary is where you go for peace and for hiding and for refuge, So already, just by mere fact that you're going into a church space, some defenses that would normally be up like this in any other space are already down. If you're going to a movie or a party, you might be hyper vigilant and alert because anything can happen at any time. But normally when we go to church environments, there's a certain level of our defenses that are already down, because we assume the people who are there, they're seeking God, they uphold certain moral standards and ethical standards, and we generally don't think bad things are likely to happen within the church. And again, the church is also groomed in certain ways, to allow certain things. So look at your neighbor and hug your brother next to you, hug your other sister next to you, okay? And I'm not saying those things are bad, but I'm saying that systematically used and introduced for the sake of sexual violence, they become instruments of grooming. And that's what happens, because remember again, you don't know you're being groomed. So this person is launching a full-on scale attack over you, and you don't even know you're at war. And just imagine the vulnerability that's there. At least if you know that this might happen or this is happening, there's a level of preparedness that you will try to get yourself to. But in this context, you don't even know. All you're seeing is Father in his big robe, or apostle or priest or whatever, and for you he probably is the closest thing to holy and the closest thing to God, and your defenses around such a person and who represents an institution that you already believe in, who represents a God you already trust, are already down. So he's just making sure he's hammering them further and further down. So now there's another element of grooming, which is environmental grooming. This one is quite big, because this is what normally maintains the abuse, the environment. So what he essentially wants to do is to groom the environment, that is the church community, that might be even the larger community, and that is sometimes your family and your friends, to trust him, to see him in a certain light, that should you ever say, something like this happened to me and this person did it, they won't trust you, because they've had experiences with him that are counter to what you're saying. They've seen him do good things. They've seen how he carries himself with integrity. They've seen how much he loves his wife. They've seen how much he works for God. So they're not going to believe you, because he has groomed them to trust you. And I'm not saying every man of God who does those things is grooming. No, I'm just saying that some of these behaviors, which under normal circumstances would perhaps be harmless, but in the hands of a sexual predator, they are instruments of grooming. So what he also does with the environment is that he normalizes abusive and sexual behavior, and he changes the thinking within that context, So and because this is a context where he has spiritual knowledge that is above everyone else, or where he's the dispenser and interpreter of the Bible and of the spiritual knowledge that you're coming to seek, he has the advantage that you sit and you listen to him talk, and he has the power in that space to influence your thinking, and he's using something that you already hold dear, which is scripture, which is the Bible, which is the word of God. And he can introduce things that normalize sexualized behavior. He can talk about David, and how David, just before he died, how he was brought a young woman to keep him company, and introduce that as something that's biblical. And not explain that some things in the Bible are not necessarily that God is saying we must do them. They're an expression of the culture of the time. Some of them, they're just capturing events that happened, but it doesn't mean that everything in the Bible is God saying we must do those things. But that's not my space. Mine is, I'm not trying to veer into their interpretation and doctrine and stuff like that. But what I am trying to say is that he will normally use scripture, misappropriate scripture, in order to groom the environment. So you get to a place where on the pulpit, it's normal to talk about, sex outside the context of marriage, for example. Or there are now sexualized jokes on the pulpit. And if you think that's far-fetched, there was an audio recording around the time of the Omotosho case where, the pastor was talking about how he has the ability to pleasure a woman and how anointed he is. If he pleasures you, you're really going to absolutely, enjoy it. His pleasuring is anointed. And he's saying this on a pulpit. And there are people who are listening, who are cheering, and who are clapping hands. And you might think, like, what kind of people think like that? But those are people who have been groomed. That's probably not the first time he ever mentions a sexual joke on the pulpit. But he probably had been introducing that kind of thinking. I'm making an example. Not just him, but I'm just saying within religious communities, there is that grooming where certain things they become accepted. Jokes that you would never say now become accepted, this one, he looks like he's the kind that can keep you up all night. You don't expect your pastor to kind of joke like that, but here he is joking about you have the potential to keep a man up all night, or he might even say you keep your husband up all night. So it's within the context of marriage, but that's not the kind of conversation that you would normally find as acceptable to be had between you and your pastor. But gradually he introduces those kind of conversations, and you start to believe, we are a church that is real, we're talking about real issues. And it's framed in a way that it's acceptable for sexualized behavior to kind of be the norm within that church environment. And the things that he uses are his position. Like I said, he's in a position where you come to listen to him most of the time. He uses his charm because he's normally charming. People who stand on the pulpit every day, even if they were not charming or charismatic when they started, but they gradually develop the skill of charm. They know how people respond and what they respond to and how to get people to think a certain way. It's like any other thing. The more you do it, the better you get to it. And there is often this saying that the anointing is attractive. I'm not too sure about whether it's the anointing or not, but I do know that when somebody is in a position of power, when they're in a position they're in an elevated position of authority, and in a context of something you respect and you honor, like when somebody is a preacher, priest, prophet, or whatever it is, they gradually become more charming than they would have if they were not in that position. Not because you are lasting or anything like that, but it comes from that deep sense of awe and appreciation of what this person is doing. But they misuse that. And because they become celebrated, so when they are celebrated, they use their celebrity status as an instrument of exclusivity, and they kind of make you feel like knowing them and being a part of them is a prize. They are the prize. Jesus is no longer the prize, but they are the prize. They are having them in your life and being led by them is this great gift, it's like even with influencers, once people are known and they have influence over people, that's why we find ourselves saying, I know that person, he grew up in the street next to me, his mother used to come and ask for transport money or whatever it might be. Once people blow up, people have a tendency to do that because it's a human thing that people want to be associated with people who are an image of success to them or to a greater community. It's just the way it is. Anyone and everyone. If there's a guy who grew up in your neighborhood and now he's an international soccer star, you're going to tell somebody that, I know this guy. He used to, we used to play, we used to walk to school together. And that's what they use as well. They use this celebrity status that becomes this prize that you now want to be affiliated with. You feel pride when you say, my pastor, Bishop, was saying to me the other day, prophet was saying that I really should, and that's not anything that we can fault anybody on. It's just human nature because we all like to gravitate towards what we think is success. And especially if our ideas around success have to do with spirituality. So they use that as well. And they also want grooming the community instill this idea that this community is a special, peculiar community. It's unlike any other community. So when you're part of this church, this is a special place, So you don't ever want to lose the affiliation with this special place. They'll say, this is where God comes. This is where God, likes to tabernacle or whatever phrase they like to use. But there's this impression of the exclusivity of this community. And, people buy expensive brands because they're exclusive. We are attached to things that we feel are exclusive. And that has to do with a sense of belonging and things like that. So they really build and anchor that into that community so that should you one day come back and say, Pastor raped me, and now the people who are in a position to do something about it, think about the potential loss of being part of that community, because community is an important human need. If you think about the hierarchy of needs, that sense of belonging to somewhere where you are significant and known and wanted is a need every human being has. And when he builds this perception that this community is exclusive and it's a family and it's a brotherhood or a sisterhood, people don't want to lose that. People don't want to lose that. And that's why a lot of the time, people who are part of those communities don't believe victims, because to believe them would mean that they would now probably have to forfeit this community that feels their own needs. So that's part of the grooming. Now, the other grooming is psychological. This is a big one. This is a big one, and it's one that I think the consequences of are quite impactful in the long run, because like I said before, he gets you to not trust yourself. So imagine when you cannot trust yourself. Imagine what that is like, and then you've been violated and you cannot even trust your understanding or perception about what your body is telling you. It's a trap. It's the psychological prison that he's able to put you in through psychological grooming. So the primary aims of psychological grooming is to disarm you psychologically. So any defenses that you would have had, your mind sometimes, you have inbuilt defenses around certain things, when you go on a date and you see the guy that is on a date with you now all of a sudden shout at the waiter for looking at you strange. You're already like, no, this is not the kind of guy I would want to be because if he does that to a waiter, what else is he going to do? So those are some of the defenses you have in your mind, the telltale signs that you when you look at, you're like, danger here. But he disarms that. he switches off those alarms in your mind through psychological grooming. He confuses you because, like I said, you feel one thing, but he says another. And he's this high and mighty person who everybody in the community you're part of trusts, and so you're confused. He gets you to trust him. He gets your family members to trust him more than you trust yourself. And part of that is that he uses your vulnerabilities. So his strategy will differ depending on what your vulnerabilities are. And remember, he has access to your vulnerabilities. He knows what your vulnerabilities are, because most of the time when we come to church, we all know that we're not perfect. There are things we want to improve on, whether in our life, or in our spirituality, or perhaps there's a sin we're dealing with, or there's a dysfunction in the family that we need healing from. We're all going through something. And when you go to church, we have this perception that somebody who has ascended to the position of authority that he currently sits at as the pastor or prophet or overseer, he has some spiritual wisdom and insight that would probably be useful in guiding me on how to deal with the challenges that I am facing and that I need godly intervention on. And this is how we normally end up sharing things with these predators that they actually end up using to basically violate people. So for example, maybe you're going there because you lost your, you've gone to church, and while you're at church you lose your job, with COVID-19 and all the retrenchments and everything that's happening. Okay, you've lost your job, and perhaps you go on a one-on-one retreat with the pastor, and you say, Pastor, things have been difficult, ever since the pandemic. My husband lost his job, I've lost my job. Things are sour at home. We're always fighting to the point where we're not even intimate. And I just don't see him as a man because he's not able to provide. These are things that you tell somebody in confidence, trusting that they are going to respect the sacredness of what you're saying, and they're going to respect whatever vow that they have made with God when he allowed them to see into people's vulnerabilities. And you think he's going to take care of that. In Catholic spaces, sometimes it's the confessional booth, where you go there and you say, Father, I've sinned, I've done this and this and this. That the person listening on the other side is bound by a certain oath to not, disclose your vulnerabilities, your nakedness, but to help you, kind of heal from it or progress from it, using whatever spiritual wisdom that God has given them. But for these people, this is actually their scouting ground. So all the issues that you bring before them actually helps them to select their victims, because they see vulnerabilities. Okay, this one has a financial issue. So if I can capitalize on the financial issue, it's going to give me access. Oh, okay, this one has marital issues. So if I can find a way to increase the marital issues, that can work to my advantage. Oh, this one is struggling with this kind of sin. They feel overwhelmed by guilt. This could be to my advantage. Oh, the mother and father are not. Oh, there's divorce. Oh, there's HIV. Whatever it is, he has access to all of that information. And basically, if he's somebody who is an abuser, he's just using those vulnerabilities to pick and choose and see what he can use to his advantage. So let me give a real life practical example. So let's say there is a woman, and let's say she is married, and she has told pastor, prophet, maybe during a retreat, a spiritual retreat, maybe a church camp, whatever the context may be, or maybe a prayer, what is it called? Prayer request. Maybe she wrote it down somewhere that, my marriage is going through a lot right now because we don't have money, we're not being sexually intimate, and I don't feel like my husband is being a man, we're fighting, and I need God to intervene on this. And this man sees it, and he chooses that vulnerability as something that he wants to exploit. Okay? And maybe in that one-on-one session or encounter, perhaps he will say, no, God is going to give you a word. God is going to give you a word, and don't worry. There will be a solution. God is a God of solutions, whatever ways he puts it, and that's fine. But now remember, I said this is somebody that has the advantage of your captive attention, because he stands on a pulpit and he ministers, and ministering to you, definitely it goes into your mind and alters your mind. He alters your thinking, it shapes your perception, and obviously people who speak into our lives, we hope that they have our best interests at heart and they're going to speak good things. But now when this person is a sexual predator, and he knows that there's a problem here with marriage and there's no intimacy and there's a problem with money, maybe one day he'll get on the pulpit and he'll start talking about how, broke men are not attractive. The power and the strength of a man is in his ability to provide. It's a sermon. He's not saying, hey, broke men are not attractive. He's just preaching. Broke men are not attractive. A woman needs a man who is a provider. You can even find that you being broke makes her not sexually attractive to you. You're sitting there and you're listening to the sermon, you're feeling like, he's right. You didn't think of it as a broke man is not attractive before, but he's planted that thought in your mind, and now you're sitting with an idea that broke men are not attractive. You might even find yourself repeating it to one of your girlfriends. Broke men are not attractive. It's not really your thought. He planted it there during an innocent sermon, and now the thought is in your mind. 10, 20 days later, whatever time frame passes, he starts to preach perhaps another message. I'm making an example of preaching, but obviously it's not always in the context of preaching. Perhaps it's conversations. Perhaps if you have access to him or he has access to you, maybe you work together or whatever. It might be just be in conversations, But perhaps he says something else, people who go out and have affairs, they need to be, if you're going to cheat, at least be smart about it. You need to cheat with somebody whom that, they're not going to give you any spiritually transmitted diseases. You're not going to have to deal with spiritual husband and spiritual wives, He didn't say anybody should have an affair. He didn't say anybody should go and have extramarital sex. But he did plant the idea to somebody who's already vulnerable because their marriage is going through some stuff. He's already planted this idea that, people who cheat, at least they need to cheat with people that, they know are not going to carry any demons or spiritually transmitted, sexually transmitted demons, They've already planted the idea that, a man who's not able to provide, is not sufficient, And he's planting ideas and watering them. So they are growing. Not only is he not sufficient because he's not able to provide, but hey, when women have, or when a person has an affair, they need to at least think, and find somebody who doesn't have any demons. And who else, in your mind at least, doesn't have demons? If it's not the high and mighty pastor, preacher, prophet who, often present themselves as quite holy and, they don't struggle with sin and they are holier than thou. That's normally the image a lot of them try to project. Not all of them, but a lot of them like to project that image. So now you're thinking affair, you're thinking of your husband in a way that you didn't think about, him not being able to provide, and you're thinking about affairs are better when they are with people who don't have demons. You're catching yourself thinking things you never thought, like, what kind of affair is better? But the idea has been planted and it's continuously being watered in your mind. And perhaps there's a deliverance that happens and somebody is being delivered, and the deliverance, it's said that it's a spiritual husband, and pastor says, you see what I was telling you, people, you need to be careful who you join yourself with, because this woman is struggling because of a spiritual husband. She is in bondage. There is no money. There's lack in her life because of a spiritual husband. Again, it reinforces the ideas that were already planted in your mind. Time goes by. Remember the example I gave? She said it was 2 years of grooming. Time goes by. Perhaps somebody speaks about perhaps they had a dream, or perhaps not even somebody, perhaps it's a pastor who starts to preach. Some of you, I know you see me in your dream. I won't talk about what you see me doing in your dream, but some of you see me in your dream, and you must know that seeing me in your dream, is a good thing. Sometimes perhaps it's a visitation, or whatever way he wants to frame it. So now if you were not dreaming about him, you must understand that it's very possible from that day you will start to dream about him. And remember, he's already planted ideas about affairs, about, being with people who are holy and stuff like that. And perhaps he even one day jokes. Perhaps you are serving in the church and he jokes and he says, when you're a man, you may have to make sure that you please your wife. You must please your wife. Don't defraud her. Make sure you go all out and you please your wife. It seems innocent, absolutely, and he's completely right. A man should please his wife. But in the context of all of these ideas that are systematically being planted, you are now sitting at a place where in your mind it's an idea to dream about him has been planted, an idea of him being somebody who's able to sexually please. And before you know it, you're waking up from a dream you need to repent from because you dreamt of the pastor pleasing you sexually, and you feel like you probably have demons and you need to go back to repent and you don't know how to deal with it. And so you run to him and you say, Pastor, I don't know how to tell you this, but I've had these really inappropriate dreams about you. That is where he's actually able to gauge that his grooming, one, is effective, and two, he's broken a wall where you and him can talk about sex between you and him. A conversation you would have never ever allowed your mind to even ponder on for more than a millisecond. But here you are talking about the pastor and you're saying, I had a dream. And then he normalizes it and he says, you're not the only one who's ever had it. What did you see in the dream? And it's a bit awkward that you need to describe. So, Pastor, I saw, what else did you see? So you are now narrating a scenario where you and the pastor are having sex. And remember, not only is he hearing it, but your mind is hearing it as well. And that reaffirms that idea all over again, because now it's a scene that was not only in your mind, but you've taken it out of your mind, you've said it out loud, and it's playing back inside your mind. And now you're at a place you would have never thought you would have ever been 6 months ago, where you and the pastor can talk about sex. And that's when they normally start to push boundaries. Perhaps he'll talk, after you narrate, he'll jokingly say, that doesn't sound bad, actually. Okay. Perhaps in the narration you said, I dreamt we were in a red blanket. I'm making an example. Before you know it, you and pastor have a joke about a red blanket, Maybe he can see you and you're wearing red and he says, red looks nice on you. Looks random. You're with your husband, you're with your children, you're rushing into church and pastor says, red is a really good color on you. The two of you know what red is between the two of you. So you now have an inside joke that's about sex and it's between the two of you. And this is all because he's gotten your psychological defenses down. At this point, he's really hammered them down. And another way that he uses psychological grooming. So here, what I want you to see is that he's introduced new ways of thinking. He's broken down boundaries about what you could think about and what you could talk about. He's broken down physical boundaries, because now for you and him, a hand touch, a hug is a normal thing. Not just for the two of you. I mean, in our church, this is what we do in our church community or in our parish or whatever the name is that you call that community. So he's changed your way of thinking. You now have inside jokes, and that's where now a special bond, a special relationship is forming, because you and pastor have this inside discussion that nobody else knows about. And he might even reciprocate it and say, when I first started in ministry, I also used to struggle with something like that. Now pastor has shared a vulnerable thing about him to you. And he might even say, I've never shared it with anybody else. Wow. Pastor is trusting me with this vulnerability in him, or with this gravity of information. It really shows that we have a special connection, a special bond. He might even say, you're special. I've been praying to God to bring me somebody I can be myself with, you know. It's not easy to always be Bishop. But I'm so grateful to God that he chose you. You are actually an answer to a prayer for me, because I've been asking God to allow me to have somebody I can be like that with. Your mind doesn't even register that shouldn't he be like that with his wife, but you are now stuck on the fact that, one, you are an answer to a prayer that he prayed, this exclusive person, this holier than thou person, and God is using you in his life. You have the opportunity to be of service in the man of God's life. You are a place where he can just talk freely and not be Bishop. I mean, your mind is now trained. To somebody else, it might sound ludicrous, but for the grooming you've gone through, it's actually starting to look more like an honor that you don't want to lose, because I get to be this for the man of God. Especially now when you look at the fact that at home, there's no intimacy, emotional, psychological, there's no intimacy. So you redirect conversations that you should be having with your husband or with your fiance with him. And he's engineered that situation. He has engineered it. Willingly, intentionally, systematically got the both of you to that point. And you couldn't necessarily have fought it because you didn't know what was happening. And remember, this is a trusted person. So yeah, another thing that they normally do in terms of psychological grooming is that they isolate you, psychologically isolate you. So you now have this special relationship. He can call at 12. Nothing sexual is happening, but you have a bond with the pastor, and he calls, and sometimes he might even ask your opinion on things, and that makes you feel so extra special. What did you think about today's sermon? And you feel like he really wants me to give my input, so you paying extra attention to sermons because he might ask you about the sermon, but laced within that sermon is other grooming techniques, other phrases he's planting in there to further groom you, and you are very attentive at that time. You're not missing any sermons, and he gets you to basically a point where you might find yourself consulting him about decisions, maybe more than your husband or your girlfriends or anybody else who was close in your life, and you feel like, I need to talk to the pastor. He gets me and he doesn't judge, so pastor, I'm thinking I should venture into this business. Oh, you want to venture into that business? He might spiritualize it. Let me pray about it. You've got somebody who is invested in your life and the future, and they're willing to pray on your behalf. With so many other people needing prayer. Oh my God, I feel so special. Pastor said he's going to personally pray about this. Imagine how special you're feeling right now. And feeling special is not a sin. Feeling special, again, when we look at a hierarchy of needs, we want to feel that sense of belonging, that sense of value in someone else's life. There are billions of other people in the world, and relationships are what give us that sense of value, when we feel like we are important to someone. And everybody, in some shape, form, has that need. It's a need. And he uses that. So you have this connection and you trust him, and he's open with you, you're open with him. You've got some inside jokes about the color red that absolutely nobody knows about. And he knows your vulnerabilities, and you're telling him more about yourself. Before I actually got married, this happened to me. Or actually, when I was a child, my dad abandoned us and he got married to another woman. So I grew up without a father, and that thing has always hurt me, and that's why I'm scared if anything would ever happen to my marriage, because I don't want my children to not have a father. He now knows that you have daddy issues, like a lot of women do. And these are significant issues. So maybe you were neglected as a child by your father. Maybe he was present but absent, emotionally absent. Maybe he left, but you have this void for a father. And once he sees that, he will strategically position himself to fill that void. So believe you me, if what you needed was 10%, he will make sure he gives 110%. So it will be all the things that you've been secretly internally wishing you would have had, and he will go all out to try and recreate that if it's possible. But he will try to meet those unmet needs. And that just tightens the stronghold, and it secures the grooming even further. And another thing that they normally use is the gifts. So he knows your vulnerabilities. Or sometimes it's not gifts, it's enticements. So he knows your vulnerabilities. He knows you need rent. He knows you need to go back to school, or you have a desire to go back to school. He knows that there's a lack of sexual intimacy in your marriage. And he might start now giving you gifts to fulfill those things. So there's a scholarship in the church, and he says, you know what, I've been praying and I think God is leading me that this scholarship, you should be awarded. Or maybe your children are struggling with funds. I think you should get those funds. Or you just need money, God has laid it in my heart that I should give you this, And obviously it's also the privileges of the special access that you have to this person that everybody, admires and looks up to. And they just keep on piling up all of these good things that you didn't have and you internally wanted to have access to, and he starts providing them, and he's filling that gap in your space and in your heart and your mind. And the danger with somebody giving things that you don't have is that he wills the power to kind of close the tap. He can withdraw those things. And once you've become accustomed to them, it really hurts. It's better that you never experience them than to have experienced and then they are kind of cut off. So these enticements become actually a mechanism of control. So perhaps he's now put you in a position of leadership within the church. And perhaps now when he starts testing boundaries with you and starts seeing whether or not really you will engage in the sexual relationship with him, and he sees some resistance, then he withholds these things that you absolutely enjoy. So you can't serve in this position anymore, and he can spiritualize it. I think you need to take a break, focus on your marriage. It's been 2 years that he's never even actually offered you advice on the marriage, nothing constructive anyway, but all of a sudden, because he made an advance at you and you still had enough, foresight, or you still had enough wisdom to say, I'm not comfortable with that, then he punishes you. It's not said that it's punishment, but it is punishment. So, that scholarship we promised, no, the budget is looking a little bit thin this year. I think we need to reconsider. And I know some people will think then it means you love things too much, and why don't you, give up those things and all of that. But remember, in the example I gave, this woman had been groomed for a period of 2 years. So you can imagine how deep the stronghold is in her mind, and she's psychologically isolated. Maybe in that period she's even lost friends. Maybe she's given up her family, because she was no longer accessible, or she was thinking in a way that was unfamiliar, and people started to kind of step back from her. So it really is deep, and she might even try it. She might even try keep a distance and keep away from him. But it will be difficult. It will be extremely difficult because she's been groomed to live in that experience with him, and he's become an integral part of her psyche. And remember, like I said before, she consults him for everything, and now he's not here and she needs to make a decision, and she really feels like she's unable to, because he's even taught her not to trust herself. He might have even taught her not to trust other people in her life. So it really isn't as simple as walking away. That's why even when people talk about domestic abuse and they say, why didn't you just leave? They don't understand the depth of it all. And it's not as simple opening a door and just leaving. It's so much deeper, because the strongholds are so deep and they are so strategically placed within your physical environment and within your internal, emotional, and psychological environment. That's why, like I said, I'm not sure if I mentioned it, but when we do research and we look at now the consequences of sexual violence, so let me just say rape by clergy or by somebody in a position of religious authority. So when a member is, let's say, raped by a pastor, when we look at it in terms of research, the consequences of it, it's actually similar to incest. So that's how far-reaching and how deep it is, that if we try to kind of compare it with any other manifestation of sexual violence, the one that it compares the closest to is incest, and that is sexual violation between family members. So it really can have the consequences of having been violated, let's say, by your actual brother or your actual father. That's how deep, do you understand? I'm trying to put it into perspective. It really is not that simple. So please have compassion, because the things that happen psychologically and the things that happen in this environment that we prize so much really have an effect on our lives. I mean, spirituality has a profound effect on our lives. There are things we don't do simply because of the faith that we have in God and what we believe God wants as far as those things are concerned. So, there are people, for example, who will not take medication and rather die because of a belief that they have. So do not trivialize the power that the spirituality of things have. If spirituality and religion is a significant part of your worldview and your frame of thinking and your reference, it really is that significant. So the last thing I want to get into, perhaps I'll just list it, is that grooming technique typically happens in stages, and I'm just going to quickly go through the stages, and maybe at a later time we might break them down, in detail if there's a need. Maybe you can just let me know if you really would like us to go into that discussion, but a lot of it we've touched on already. So the initial step is, the first stage is targeting of the victim. So like I said, he knows your vulnerabilities, he has access to them because a lot of them are shared, or there are people who come and maybe they say, sister so-and-so is struggling with this, whatever the platform is. Maybe he's in a confessional booth and he's hearing you confess these vulnerabilities, whatever it is, but he has access to knowledge about vulnerabilities that you have in your life that other people would ordinarily not have. And normally he uses that to help him decide who he should target, which victim he should target, what vulnerability does he feel like he can best exploit in a way that would enable him to abuse you and then maintain the abuse and get away with it, basically. So if he feels that somebody who's in need financially is vulnerable in a way that best suits him because maybe he's got money, then that's going to help inform the decision on who he's actually going to target. The second stage is gaining trust, and this is where I spoke about gaining your trust, and it's also about gaining the trust of your family, for example, gaining the trust of the people in your environment. And it really can get insidious, especially when it gets to a point where maybe, for example, you are starting to feel like, I need to tell somebody this has gone too far. Maybe by the grace of God, you are getting some kind of a wake-up call and you want this to stop. But because he has gained so much trust, he might probably have factored in the trust of your family members such that they would never believe you. So maybe when he starts to see the resistance, he tells your family member who already trust him because of his position and authority as a leader that, I think Debu is struggling with the spirit of lust. I see it, it's been revealed. She needs prayer. Let's support her in our prayers. And here Debu comes and says, you know what? I think the pastor is trying to do something sexual with me. Already your family trusts him. He's already went ahead of you and he has said you are struggling with lust. So who are they going to believe? They're going to think you are under some kind of demonic oppression. There's a spirit over you that's making you to lust, and you are construing his kindness and his goodness because of the spirit of lust. It's an example. But what I'm saying is that this trust is such a big element of it all. It is the stronghold that keeps the abuse going, actually. And it's one thing that they really, really work hard to gain and to maintain. The third stage is that feeling of a need, and that's why I said he might feel the need of a father figure if you needed that. And sometimes the need he feels is not even just yours, it's the need of the family. The family might have a collective need. Maybe there are people in the family who need to go to school, and he uses the church scholarship because he has power over that to send your brothers and sisters to school, for example, or you need to further your education somehow. So he fulfills that need for you, or maybe for your family, or even for that environment. And that builds that trust and confidence in him. The fourth stage is isolation. And we saw this with the Omotosho case. And in a lot of other cases, this element is always there. Even if it's not physical, it can be psychological. But it also takes place physically, especially in children. So with the Omotosho case, we saw where, these girls were put in a mission house. And that's physical isolation. So he's able to do what he wants to do uninterrupted because he has isolated them physically. But sometimes it's not that kind of physical isolation, it's that psychological isolation. And physical isolation doesn't mean being away for months. Sometimes the isolation is the fact that you need to go on some time of prayer. I think you should join the other leaders or the other congregants on a retreat that you are going to go away for, maybe for 5 days. So you are away from the comfort of your home and your safety and your husband and, you know, things and places and people who would be an anchor and safety for you. He's got you isolated from that environment. Another stage then, or the fifth stage rather, is the sexual contact. So that is when he eventually does assault you sexually. He does, you know, rape. It's a difficult one for me. He does eventually then rape his victim, as he has been planning all along, like this lady, the example I gave, for 2 years. And the really absurd thing about it is that normally in this process, he wants you to believe that you're an active participant, that you wanted it, and that this is something that the both of you did. And that's why a lot of times you read about pastors making their victims pray along with them and saying, you know, God, please forgive us for what we have done, you know. Or it might even be something that he expresses that God has approved, you know, it's between the two of you. So you are acting this out because it's been sanctioned by God. I mean, the stories are really crazy, and these are factual things that have actually happened. I mean, there's another pastor who was married, and he actually wanted to be with another woman who, I think she was engaged, if I'm not mistaken. And he was telling her that God had said that they need to produce a prophet. And this was an instruction from God, and they needed to come together and produce this prophet because, you know, he needed to come from the two of them, not between him and his wife, but him and this person in his church. So this is how he kind of gets you to think that you are a part of your own abuse, and that even robs you of the opportunity to mourn what has happened to you because of this great element of being complicit, this manipulation of making you believe that you are complicit in something you are not complicit in. So after the sexual contact, then there's the maintaining of control. So now that this has happened, you know, he can, a lot of the times in this context, spiritual elements are used and abused to maintain the control. You know, it might be, you know, being told that if you say anything, you know, there will be the judgment of God, you know, or, you know, especially in communities like African communities where communal wholeness is kind of more prized than individual. So you need to think about the bigger picture. You need to think about the church. You need to think about the souls, you know, and that maintains control, because dare you say something, then it compromises this entire community, and the well-being of the community surely needs to be more important than your own, because if it isn't, then it means you're selfish. That's the idea that's being brought into your thinking. Those are the kind of ideas that are brought in to maintain control and to keep the secrecy. You know, and let's say it happened in the context that you were married, and he now terms it as something that you did before. And if you say anything now, you know, he can, some of them, they overtly threaten you. They threaten to do something to your husband or to your family. It really depends on with what kind of monster you're dealing with at the end of the day. But they do want to try their best to maintain that control over you, and that their secret doesn't come out. And if possible, that they get to do this with you for as long as they want to, until they move on to the next person. So yeah, I know I've said a mouthful. So that's basically sexual grooming. And believe it or not, that is in a nutshell. So I think we need to end it here for today. Thank you so much for sticking it out with me and really, you know, giving us your time and your attention and investing, you know, in yourself to get this knowledge. And some of the things, I think if you start thinking about, you've seen them before. You've seen them before. If you think about it, there are traces. You've seen. And I'm not saying look at one isolated thing and then, you know, say, I've been groomed. But look at the systematic application of these techniques that I've been pointing out. And the other thing I wanted to say is that you need to start looking out for, in your own life or in the family or in the life of a family member who you think might be in danger, these friendship formings that you don't understand with the leader. You know, I'm not saying leaders shouldn't have friends, but there's sometimes this element of friendship that you're trying to understand. What kind of friendship does my 24-year-old cousin and my 56-year-old pastor have? What? So start to be on the lookout. You know, the Holy Spirit will illuminate it, you know, to you. Somehow, something in you might not be right about it. I'm not saying all friendships are wrong, but I'm just saying things to look out for. And start looking out for isolation, you know, when this person that maybe you're concerned about starts to isolate themselves from you and from other family members, and, you know, all they really think about as a reference for their decision making comes from this one person. It's a red light. I'm not saying all instances, but I'm just saying look out for it, okay? And if you yourself feel like you might be an object of somebody grooming you, start looking out for testing. And testing is when he pushes certain behaviors and see how you react. If there was a hand holding, and then next thing there's, you know, the breasts, and there's conversations about kissing after that, he's testing boundaries. Those are not all collectively coincidences. He's testing. So once you start seeing that he's testing to see how I'll respond to these increasing levels of sexual behavior that he's exposing me to, red light must flicker somewhere in your mind or in your spirit. So let me leave it here for now. Thank you so much. And so we will be back next week, and we will tackle another topic and have another conversation. So thank you for, you know, coming into the space with me and looking into this space and seeing and hearing with me. And I'm so grateful that you're taking this journey with us. So please remember to check us out on, we are on YouTube, Her Story. We're on Facebook, Her Story. And really, I just would like to get this message to as many people as possible, because I really do believe that it has the potential to save somebody and potentially lead somebody in the direction of healing. Thank you so much.